When Prince Andrew stepped inside the palace walls once more, it wasn't with the arrogance of old, but with desperation etched into every line of his face. What he asked of King Charles stunned the courtiers who overheard and set into motion a royal clash that would divide blood against duty. Gone were the days when Andrew commanded attention through charm or entitlement. This was a man stripped of dignity, clutching at the fragile remnants of a royal life that had long slipped away from him. His footsteps, heavy with years of scandal and isolation, carried him into a chamber where history itself seemed to pause, waiting to record what would unfold. He did not come to apologize, nor did he come to seek quiet reconciliation. Instead, he came to demand what he believed was his due reinstatement, a place once again at the heart of the monarchy, and the restoration of a life he claimed had been unjustly torn away from him. The words that left his lips shocked those within earshot. This was not a plea framed in humility, but a declaration wrapped in entitlement. Andrew called it his birthright, an inheritance of presence within the palace halls that no scandal, no disgrace should have been able to erase. The audacity hung in the air, a bitter echo against the silence of the chamber. For Charles, seated, with the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, the moment was electric. Courtiers later said his expression was unreadable, a mask of composure that barely concealed the storm beneath. The silence that followed Andrew's words was heavier than any outburst. And yet, behind Charles's stillness, fury simmered, like fire waiting for oxygen. Those present described the tension in the room as unbearable. It was as though the palace itself, its gilded walls and centuries-old windows, leaned in to listen, holding its breath. The staff spoke in hushed tones afterward of the unease, of the invisible chasm that opened in that very moment between brothers who had once shared childhood secrets and who now stood on the edge of irrevocable fracture. This was no simple family squabble. This was a confrontation of past sins colliding with the future of the crown, a demand for re-entry into a world that had closed its doors and bolted them shut. For Andrew, the desperation was not just about status. It was about relevance in a world that had left him behind. In his private life, the shadows of loneliness crept closer each day. Wealth that once seemed endless had dwindled, eroded by settlements, legal costs, and a reputation forever marred. The grandeur of palaces had been replaced with the silence of empty halls, the echoes of former glory, a cruel reminder of what had been lost. He clung to the idea that returning to the palace would restore not only his position, but also his identity. Without it, he was not a prince. He was a man cast out, left to wither outside the circle of power. But Charles saw through it. He knew this wasn't an appeal to serve the monarchy's future. It was a grasp at saving face, an attempt to rewrite history in Andrew's favor. The very notion collided with the path Charles had chosen, the future he envisioned, one rooted firmly in William and Catherine. Andrew's request was not only a challenge to his authority as king, but a threat to the loyalty and public trust he had been rebuilding brick by brick. This was more than a brother asking for mercy. This was a man demanding entry back into a world he had helped tarnish, with no thought for the damage his return could inflict. And so, beneath the calm exterior, Charles's fury burned hotter with every word. It wasn't just about Andrew's audacity. It was about what this plea represented. The past clawing at the future. A scandal attempting to reclaim the throne of respectability. Blood ties were no longer enough to excuse betrayal. Not when the survival of the monarchy depended on clarity, dignity, and the steady hands of William and Catherine. Charles's silence, though brief, became a wall Andrew could not penetrate. a barrier built of duty and conviction. But Charles was not prepared to hand the keys of power back to a man whose past threatened everything he had fought to preserve. The moment Andrew uttered his plea, Charles's face transformed. Gone was the patient monarch. What followed was a blistering tirade that left even Andrew speechless. For years, Charles had carried himself with measured restraint, careful to shield his emotions from the world. But now, the mask shattered. His voice rose, sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the heavy air with a force no one expected. Courtiers, who later whispered about this confrontation, said they had never seen Charles so utterly consumed by fury, his every word striking like a hammer against a brother he no longer recognized. Charles did not hesitate to bring the darkest truths into the open. He reminded Andrew of the scandals that had dragged the monarchy through the mud, scandals that had stripped away dignity and trust from an institution already fragile under public scrutiny. With each accusation, the king's words grew heavier, echoing the anger of a nation that had long since turned its back on Andrew. He spat out the words with finality. "You will never return to tarnish what I have rebuilt." This wasn't just anger. It was a declaration of exile, a verdict that carried more weight than any royal decree. The sheer intensity of his voice left Andrew stunned, unable to summon the usual arrogance that had defined so much of his life. But beneath this eruption lay years of buried resentment. Charles had always lived in the shadow of his brother's recklessness, forced to defend a monarchy that Andrew seemed determined to drag into ruin. Now, as king, he could no longer allow sentiment to cloud his judgment. This was not just a clash of brothers, it was the release of decades of frustration. For Charles, Andrew's entitlement had become unbearable. Each demand, each whisper of self-justification was a reminder of wounds that had never fully healed. And so, with the eyes of advisors fixed on him, Charles unleashed his fury not only as monarch, but as a brother who had been pushed too far. Witnesses to the confrontation later confessed they had never seen Charles so unrestrained. His words were laced with venom, his tone unyielding. It was the angriest they had ever seen him, an explosion of raw emotion from a man known for caution. Even the palace staff, seasoned in navigating royal storms, were shaken by the violence in his words. This was no mere rejection. This was a public execution of Andrew's last shred of hope, a moment that would forever be remembered as the end of brotherly forgiveness. The bond of shared blood was shattered, replaced by a brutal truth. Andrew no longer had a place within the walls of power. And yet, in this eruption, there was something more telling. Charles's rage carried with it a deeper message. His fury wasn't only about Andrew's past, it was about the future he was determined to protect. Between every scathing word, between every bitter reminder of Andrew's disgrace, one truth rang clear. Charles's loyalty no longer belonged to his brother. It belonged to William and Catherine, the heirs of hope, the shield of the monarchy's future. By condemning Andrew, Charles was drawing a line in history itself, choosing duty, choosing survival, choosing the next generation over the broken ties of the old. Yet Andrew's humiliation was only the beginning for Charles's loyalty to William, and Catherine would soon be sealed in a way that would shake the monarchy to its core. While Andrew begged for redemption, William and Catherine quietly shaped the battlefield from behind closed doors. Their influence reached farther than Andrew could have ever imagined. In the silence that followed Charles's eruption, it was not Andrew's voice that mattered most. It was the unspoken weight of William and Catherine's presence, a force that had already sealed his fate before he had even uttered a word. Behind the gilded doors of the palace, the couple's resolve was unshakable. They had no need to confront Andrew directly, for their very existence as the monarchy's future had already cast him into the shadows. Privately, William made his position clear. He would not tolerate the return of a man whose scandals had nearly brought the crown to its knees. Courtiers later whispered that William's words were firm, not fiery, but carried a weight that even Charles recognized as the voice of destiny. This was not youthful impetuousness, but the calculated restraint of a man stepping fully into the role of monarch-in-waiting. He did not scream or demand. He simply made it known that Andrew's return would undo years of progress, unravel the trust carefully rebuilt, and stain the monarchy just as it fought for survival in the modern age. Catherine's influence was even more profound. Those close to the family recalled how she pressed the issue with a quiet but unyielding conviction. To Catherine, the matter was not merely about public image or protocol. It was about the legacy she and William would pass on to their children. She spoke of a monarchy untarnished, one that could not allow itself to be dragged back into scandal, when its future was already fragile. Her words carried an emotional force that cut deeper than any outburst. She was determined that George, Charlotte, and Louis would inherit an institution cleansed of Andrew's shadow, one built upon dignity rather than disgrace. The courtiers, once divided in their loyalties, began to unite behind William and Catherine. They described the couple as the shield of the monarchy's future, protectors who had not only weathered storms, but risen stronger from them. Every public appearance reinforced that perception. Where Andrew's name drew whispers of shame, Catherine's presence drew applause, and William's steady demeanor earned respect. The nation no longer looked to Andrew as a prince. They looked to William and Catherine as the embodiment of everything. The crown could still be. Even Charles, who had long wrestled with the conflict between blood and duty, saw the truth with increasing clarity. His fury at Andrew was real, but it was also sharpened by the contrast standing before him. The crown's survival was not in the hands of a disgraced brother begging for scraps of relevance, but in the loyal devotion of a son and daughter-in-law, who had given everything to safeguard the monarchy's image. The balance of power had shifted, not through titles or decrees, but through loyalty, perception, and destiny itself. And as this truth crystallized, Andrew's desperation grew darker, leading to whispered schemes that would only dig his pit deeper. Denied by his brother, Andrew turned to whispers, plotting, and old allies. What he planned next wasn't just a plea, it was a rebellion cloaked in desperation. Stripped of Charles's forgiveness and faced with the cold reality that William and Catherine had closed the gates of the future against him, Andrew's heart hardened. He refused to fade quietly into the margins of history. Instead, he began searching for cracks in the fortress that had been built to exclude him. His path was no longer about regaining honor, but about clawing back relevance, no matter the cost. He reached out to old confidants, the ones who had long thrived in the shadows of palace discontent. Some were distant relatives who felt overlooked. Others were friends who believed the monarchy had grown too sanitized under Charles's hand. To them, Andrew presented himself as a victim, a prince wronged, stripped of his destiny by the iron grip of a brother more concerned with image than blood. Behind closed doors, he spun tales of injustice, and in hushed meetings, he painted a picture of himself as the rightful son of the house disgraced. Yes, but still born to rule. Each conversation was a thread in a web he hoped might bind together, a force strong enough to challenge the king's decree. But whispers inside the palace walls soon reached the press. And it was no coincidence. Andrew had begun feeding fragments of stories to select journalists, subtle yet deliberate leaks meant to rekindle sympathy and stir division. Articles began to appear suggesting that the disgraced prince had been treated too harshly, that perhaps redemption should not be denied to one of the Queen's own sons. Between the lines, Andrew's fingerprints were evident. He wanted the public to believe he still had a claim, that the monarchy was incomplete without him. Yet, these efforts carried a sinister undertone, for they were not just about persuasion. They were veiled threats aimed at the heart of the institution. Rumors swirled like smoke in the halls of power, whispers that Andrew might go further if ignored. Some claimed he was prepared to reveal family secrets, scandals buried deep in the vaults of royal history, unless he was restored. Whether true or exaggerated, the mere possibility sent shivers through the palace. Staff members confided later that they overheard his voice rising in anger during late-night calls, his bitterness directed not only at Charles, but at Catherine herself. He accused her of turning the king against him, of orchestrating his downfall with the quiet ruthlessness of a woman determined to protect her children's inheritance. In his eyes, Catherine was not a sister-in-law. She was the gatekeeper, the rival, the one whose influence eclipsed his blood. And yet, the more Andrew raged, the more isolated he became. Allies who once entertained his words began to retreat, unwilling to risk their own standing for a man so consumed by resentment. Friends who listened out of loyalty could no longer ignore the paranoia that clouded his every sentence. Within his estate, surrounded by silence, Andrew became both pitiful and dangerous, a man clinging to power that no longer existed, but capable of striking out in reckless ways that threatened everything. His schemes were not the measured maneuvers of a strategist, but the frantic grasps of someone drowning, desperate to pull others under with him. But Charles had already chosen his side, and his next move would silence Andrew's ambitions once and for all. As Andrew plotted in the shadows, the nation's heart turned elsewhere. Catherine's grace in public shattered any chance Andrew had of swaying opinion. The people had spoken, and their loyalty was unshakable. Wherever she went, crowds gathered not out of duty, but out of admiration. Her composure, her kindness, her quiet strength stood in stark contrast to Andrew's desperation and scandal. While he schemed in whispers, Catherine's presence became a thunderous answer, a living reminder of what the monarchy could still mean in a fractured world. She did not need to speak of Andrew. Her very existence erased him from the conversation. At public events, Catherine carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew the weight of history rested on her shoulders. Parents pointed her out to their children not just as a future queen, but as an example of character. Every step she took, every smile, every carefully chosen word reinforced the image of a woman unshaken by palace intrigue. The people saw in her something Andrew could never reclaim: purity of image, an untarnished legacy that bound her not only to William, but to Diana's memory and the promise of continuity. The more Catherine shone, the deeper Andrew sank. The Essex media caught hold of this shift and amplified it with a force that Andrew could not compete with. Headlines no longer spoke of his bid for redemption. They spoke of Catherine as the true guardian of the monarchy's future. Commentators framed her as the steadying hand guiding the crown toward stability. Analysts drew comparisons between her composure and Andrew's chaos, leaving the public to draw their own damning conclusions. And the public did not hesitate. Letters poured into newspapers, social media swelled with commentary, and even quiet petitions began to circulate, all declaring in one voice, "Andrew must never return." This groundswell of loyalty was not orchestrated. It rose naturally, born of a collective understanding that Catherine represented what the monarchy needed to survive: dignity, honor, and the trust of the people. In contrast, Andrew represented everything they wanted to leave behind. His scandals had already bruised the monarchy once. Allowing him back would be like reopening a wound that had only just begun to heal. The verdict of the people was clear, and it echoed louder than Andrew's whispered plots. Charles himself noticed the widening gap. He could see it in the reports, in the crowds, in the way his people responded not to his brother, but to his daughter-in-law. Catherine's power was quiet, but undeniable. Her reputation had grown to such heights that even the king understood. She now stood as the monarchy's greatest asset. Andrew's request was not only impossible, it was irrelevant. He had become a shadow, fading under the brilliance of Catherine's influence. The symbolism of this shift was captured in one powerful moment. At a public engagement, children rushed forward, their cheers rising for Catherine. They clutched at her hand, waved their flags, and beamed with admiration. Not one voice was raised for Andrew. That image spread quickly, a symbolic divide between the innocence of the future and the disgrace of the past. It was a moment that said more than words ever could. The people had already chosen who they wanted to lead them forward. This tidal wave of loyalty sealed Charles's heart, and Andrew's downfall quickened like a storm closing in. Inside Windsor Castle, under chandeliers that once symbolized unity, two brothers clashed in a confrontation that left the very walls echoing with fury. Andrew arrived with a final burst of defiance, determined to confront the king face to face and demand what he believed was still his right. He insisted that he deserved forgiveness, that the slate of disgrace could be wiped clean if only Charles would extend his hand. His voice trembled between desperation and arrogance, reminding all who heard him that he was not willing to fade into silence without a fight. But what Andrew saw as his last chance for redemption, Charles viewed as an unforgivable intrusion on the very stability of the crown. Charles's reply came not with diplomacy, but with thunder. His words reverberated with a finality that left no room for misunderstanding. Forgiveness is not a return. Those 6 words cut Andrew more deeply than any scandal ever had. The king's voice rose in command, his tone carrying the weight of centuries, as if the authority of every monarch before him resided in his chest. Charles made it brutally clear that forgiveness, in the spiritual sense, might be granted, but the throne, the palace, the duties of the monarchy, those would never again belong to Andrew. What had been destroyed could not be rebuilt. Yet beneath this thunderous clash ran deeper, older wounds. Andrew's voice cracked as he dredged up memories of their childhood moments when he felt overlooked, when Charles had always been the chosen one, destined for power, while he was left in the shadows. It was jealousy, long buried, now spilling into the open with venom. He accused Charles of favoritism, of hiding behind Catherine's influence to strike him down, of denying him not just a role, but his very identity. But Charles, hardened now as king, was unmoved by his brother's appeals. In that chamber, the weight of family bonds collapsed beneath the force of duty. Advisors and courtiers who stood silently at the edges witnessed something they would never forget. Charles did not merely reject Andrew, he declared in front of them all where his true loyalty rested. He spoke William and Catherine's names with deliberate emphasis, making it clear that his faith, his trust, and the monarchy's survival lay with them. It was not only a rejection of Andrew, but an anointing of the next generation, a sealing of the dynasty's future in the presence of witnesses who would spread the tale across the palace and beyond. The courtiers, seasoned as they were in palace intrigue, were stunned. They had seen rejections before, but never a moment this absolute. This was no quiet dismissal whispered in the dark. This was exile, spoken aloud, with a force that could never be undone. Andrew's pale face betrayed the crushing realization this door had not only been closed, it had been locked forever. He stormed out, his pride shattered, his last plea reduced to ashes. Those who saw him leave whispered later that he resembled a ghost, a man who had finally glimpsed the truth of his irrelevance. And yet, while Andrew retreated in disgrace, Charles's declaration had already set a chain of loyalty that would define the monarchy's next era. Though crowns had not yet touched their heads, William and Catherine were crowned that day in spirit, in loyalty, and in the eyes of the people. Charles's declaration at Windsor had been more than a rejection of Andrew. It was a coronation of sorts, a clear message that the monarchy's destiny now rested in the hands of his son and daughter-in-law. From that moment forward, the palace began to shift. Responsibilities once reserved for the king alone were quietly passed down, not as temporary duties, but as signs of permanence, foreshadowing a future already unfolding. William was entrusted with key ceremonies, his presence increasingly symbolizing continuity between the monarchy of the past and the monarchy to come. When he stood before crowds, the people no longer saw him as merely the heir. They saw him as the embodiment of the crown's survival. Catherine, too, began receiving honors once whispered about, but never formally given. She was handed jewels, not only for display, but for safekeeping, as if Charles were placing in her hands the weight of history itself. These symbolic gestures spoke volumes. They were not casual acts. They were deliberate choices, cementing William and Catherine as the monarchy's spiritual rulers before their official time. The public embraced this shift with fervor. Across the nation, the sentiment grew louder. They are already king and queen in our hearts. It was no longer a matter of waiting for Charles's reign to pass. It was a recognition that William and Catherine had already become the living face of the monarchy. Their dignity, their resilience, and their ability to embody both tradition and modernity had made them the nation's chosen leaders. Every gesture they made, every word they spoke, was magnified, not through scandal or controversy, but through trust and hope. Inside the palace, advisors who once debated succession no longer argued. Charles's decision to elevate William and Catherine was seen as the only path forward. In private, they acknowledged what the public already felt. The monarchy's survival depended not on repairing broken branches of the family tree, but on nurturing the strong, healthy roots of the next generation. Andrew's name, once a subject of endless discussions and distractions, faded entirely from the king's circle. It was as though he had been erased from the narrative, deliberately omitted from every plan, every conversation, every future vision of the crown. Yet beneath the triumph and the symbolism, there lingered an unspoken foreshadowing. For while William and Catherine's era had begun to take shape, Andrew had not accepted his exile in silence. His absence from the discussions was not surrender. It was the dark quiet of a man plotting his next move. What the monarchy saw as closure, Andrew saw as betrayal. And his silence was not the sound of peace, but of defiance, gathering strength. But Andrew's silence was not acceptance. It was the sound of a man preparing his final act of defiance. When stripped of power, a man will either fade into silence or erupt in defiance. Andrew chose the latter. and his final act shocked even his harshest critics. After being cast out of Windsor and erased from Charles's plans, he refused to accept his place in the shadows. Instead, he began a last, desperate campaign to claw back relevance, a campaign waged not in palaces or council rooms, but through whispers, letters, and the machinery of a press hungry for scandal. It was a reckless gamble, and it would prove to be the act that sealed his ruin forever. Letters began to surface, carefully placed in the hands of journalists sympathetic to his cause. In them, Andrew painted himself as the forgotten brother, a man cast aside by a cold monarchy, more interested in appearances than in family. He framed his downfall as a conspiracy, hinting at Catherine's quiet influence, at Charles's supposed betrayal, at William's looming shadow. For a moment, these stories gained traction. Some headlines spoke of injustice, of a prince denied his birthright, of a royal family willing to sacrifice one of its own to secure the future of the crown. Andrew hoped this narrative might sway public opinion, might turn whispers of sympathy into a roar of support. But instead of rekindling loyalty, his campaign backfired. The public, long weary of his scandals, grew colder than ever. They saw not a victim, but a man clinging desperately to a title already lost. His letters, dripping with bitterness, were read not as pleas for justice, but as desperate attempts to rewrite history. The contrast between his words and Catherine's quiet dignity was stark, and the people chose their side without hesitation. Polls, petitions, and commentary all told the same story: Andrew had no place in the monarchy's future. The harder he fought, the more irrelevant he became. Charles, watching this final act unfold, responded not with anger but with calculated silence. In public, he lavished praise on William and Catherine, elevating their names at every opportunity. At ceremonies, in speeches, in subtle yet symbolic gestures, he reinforced the idea that they were the beating heart of the crown. The omission of Andrew's name was deliberate, a reminder to the world that the disgraced prince had been cast beyond the pale. Each word of praise for William and Catherine was another nail in the coffin of Andrew's royal ambitions. The effect on Andrew was devastating. Isolated in his estate, he found himself surrounded not by allies, but by silence. The phones that once rang with opportunity fell quiet. The friends who once stood by him slipped away. Even those who had briefly entertained, his campaign of letters grew distant, unwilling to tie their reputations to his crumbling image. Alone with his fading relevance, Andrew's defiance curdled into despair. The louder he had shouted, the more the world had turned its back. In the end, he was not a prince fighting for justice. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of a monarchy that had moved on without him. And so, with Andrew silenced and the monarchy's loyalty sealed, Charles prepared to reveal the ultimate gesture of trust. It was more than a decision. It was a vow. Charles's loyalty to William and Catherine was not just sealed in words, but in history itself. In the quiet of the palace, he finalized symbolic gestures that would echo for generations. William was entrusted with responsibilities once reserved for kings alone, while Catherine was handed jewels that had belonged to Diana, a gesture that carried both legacy and destiny. These were not ceremonial choices, but declarations, ensuring that the path ahead was clear and unshakable. Behind closed doors, a secret decree was drawn up, cementing their role in succession beyond all doubt. The public, sensing the magnitude of these acts, embraced it as a turning point in royal history. They saw not hesitation, but conviction. A king securing the future by placing the crown's survival in the hands of those who had earned the people's unwavering loyalty. Andrew's name, once heavy in scandal, faded into obscurity, erased from the monarchy's narrative. In his absence, William and Catherine rose higher, their figures shining brighter than ever before. Yet one question lingered in whispers across the nation. Was this Charles's greatest act of loyalty, or his final betrayal of family? And thus, the monarchy's future was sealed not by blood alone, but by loyalty that will echo through history. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.